Do you want to? So I appreciate your support. All right. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but you know, we'll make it work.
Okay. All right. I don't know the process. I'm going to say something now, which may or may not be true. Anyways, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to Villanueva's dissertation proposal defense. The title of the dissertation is Enriched Lives, no, I'm sorry, Enriched Lives, Uranium Policy and Production of Power in the American Southwest. That's actually the title of the proposal, which may or may not be the title of the dissertation. As we all know, things change. So the process is Ray's going to tell us a little bit about his proposed research. Then there's going to be time for y'all to ask questions. And at a certain point, you leave, and then the committee will be alone with Ray to ask questions. The committee will deliberate amongst themselves, and then we'll give Ray the word. So that's about it. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. So, as Undersecretary said, this is my proposal defense, tentatively titled Enriched Lives, Uranium Policy and the Production of Power in the American Southwest. And as we'll discuss in a few moments, this is kind of a torture title and for various reasons. One version of that is that the American Southwest is very, very awkwardly defined in this context, because as we'll see, it's mostly Texas and one site 1 mile into New Mexico, and I just can't say it in Texas, which would have been nice.
Yeah.
And Enriched Lives is one that I've come back and forth on. The other subtitle I've had, or the other current title is Nuclear Futures, because as a continuing idea that you'll see is there's these expectations, there's these ideas of moving forward in development and investment, but not necessarily the question why. And that's what I'm hoping to understand better on the answer. So just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. I'll give a brief introduction onto the subject matter in total. Some major concepts that you'll hear me use the word repeatedly. Research questions, the theory that I'm working from, yield sites, research methods, data analysis methods, and finally the intellectual merit and broader impacts. So, to begin, I'm going to try to contextualize the story that's being told. And so the fact is, the global energy supply generated by nuclear reactors is actually expected to increase approximately 45% over the next 20 years. However, in the United States, nuclear energy creation itself is expected to drop dramatically, in general due to a lack of new development and the recent high-profile closures of nuclear generating stations in the United States. Despite these developments, though, the American Southwest, with a long historic history of ties to nuclear development, has been unusually successful in continuing to maintain and grow the potential for nuclear energy. So my project in general seeks to understand the continuing and emerging multi-billion-dollar investments in Texas and New Mexico in nuclear power, as well as their constituent components, by documenting how the mining, enrichment, use, and disposal of uranium in the Texas-New Mexico border region creates a policy culture, political structure, and energy profile that marks Texas's residents, minerals, flora, and fauna as fundamentally nuclear actors. Through this research, scholars and decision makers potentially will be able to develop a better understanding of the communities that are currently part of the uranium production cycle, including their various ideologies, socioeconomic statuses, and previously successful and unsuccessful interactions with local, state, federal governments, and private enterprises. As an overall objective to this project is to identify the ways in which actors invested in Texas' developing nuclear industry are able to successfully and unsuccessfully communicate through, with, and to each other. And so I've used some terms already that I'm going to briefly define how I'm using them. And those are agency, network, institutions, and communication. And so my project, as we'll see later, is defined by the idea of agency. When I'm using the word agency, I'm describing it as an ability to act and react on others. And the proposed project will be able to explain the mosaic of human and non-human lives and objects that are directly influenced by uranium and uranium policy. When I'm using the word network, I'm referring to a theoretical and methodological framework with which scientists can identify the linkages between people to the many objects in their lives, and how those objects connect people in complex ways. People and objects are nodes on the network, and their relations are defined through particular paths or passage. So when we might say linkages, I'm also going to be saying passages. I'm going to use the word institution at various points, and when I'm attempting to identify institutions, I'm talking to say that it is something well established when it knows how to present the values proper to each mode without at the same time being obliged to values. That's a really weird way to phrase it, but it's this idea I'm pulling from the Torah and the modes of existence, and that it's saying that institutions are something that we're building up, or we've given up, we've put stuff to the side, but they still mean something, they provide value to people. And so these institutions are these structures that we are entangled in that identify values. Now, finally, I have the word communication up here, and this is kind of a catch-all to pull in my linguistic and rhetoric training, and possibly to a degree when we talk about anthropology and discourse. So if I'm defining it as a way to get ideas across. So this project looks into various ways, including how successfully those ideas are put across, things like speaking well, as well as examining the disconnects when there's a communicative failure and when is there a purposeful failure. So we're trying to identify what forms of communication are going between all these individuals, all these nodes, and what's happening with them. So that leads me to my research questions, and these are the awkward blocks of text that I feel obliged to read word for word. So I'm awkwardly coming up forward, so let's see what I'm saying. So my research question 1 is, how does the mining, enrichment, use, and disposal of uranium in Texas and along the Texas-New Mexico border region build, transform, and or maintain relationships between nuclear technology, local communities, states, the US government, international corporations, economies, and regulatory bodies? RQ2, how is the implementation of uranium policy along the Texas-New Mexico border region produced, interpreted, and understood by the state, government, corporations, regulatory bodies, and what are the effects of these policies on the flora and fauna, the people behind these projects? And RQ3, what are the commonalities and differences in the involved communities regarding their perceptions and understandings of nuclear energy and its entanglements? Are there generalizable traits that identify a community as being amenable to an increased presence of the uranium fuel cycle, and if so, what are they? And so we can see in RQ3 there's a potential kind of applied aspect to this. I'm going to give you a brief history of what that is. And that when we were developing the research questions, we were trying to think about what would matter to someone looking at this on the outside. And the idea is identifying what are the communications and what are the communicative disconnects that people are, and businesses, governments are having to understand what's causing potential fear or not fear, what's successful and what's unsuccessful in these forms of communication. So all of this is wrapped in the theory that I'm pulling from, which are an anthropology of policy, after network theory, and awkwardly nuclear anthropology, which I'll talk more briefly on. So an anthropology of policy approach, as I'll go in deeper in a moment, demands the tracing and construction of complex networks. However, uranium is unique due to its radioactive abilities, which may have both real and imagined consequences. So using an after-network approach, this research asserts that uranium itself, through its nuclear particles, has agency. By viewing uranium as an object that has the ability to act and react on others, the proposed project will be able to examine these webs of human and non-human agency that is directly influenced by uranium and uranium policy. This conceptualization allows for the close examination of a story or social life of uranium by enabling an in-depth analysis of the vertical production of nuclear energy in Texas and New Mexico. So I'm going to talk about each of these theories a little bit more in detail right now. So as an area of research, the anthropology of policy is both a very old and a very new focus within the discipline. Weddell notes that the field of anthropology is deeply rooted in its colonial past, with early anthropologists such as Max Fleckman and Evans Pritchard being part of a tradition of working for state power and their capacity as administrators for the British Empire. During and after their commissions, both wrote detailed accounts of African tribal organizations and social institutions that identified the ways in which colonialism impacted and changed local customs. In the United States, Boas and Benedict similarly published on their work for the government, with Boas refuting ideologies of race while working for the immigration services, and Benedict conducting research from afar on America's enemies during World War II. Nonetheless, the works of Boas and Benedict tend to lack recognition and reflection of colonial policy on local populations that was tend to be found in British schools of thought. So while the study of policy within anthropology was not uncommon, it was rarely a central focus of study. However, entrees into political studies received greater attention in response to Laura Nader's call for anthropologists to study up as a necessary step in understanding the human condition. Nader claimed that many researchers used a top-down approach that accepted the words of the managers uncritically and neglected important data on how the managed use the same concepts and ideas. Nader advocated for a different approach in which social scientists would study top-down and bottom-up to develop adequate theory and description, claiming if one's pivot point is around those who have responsibility by virtue of being delegated power, then the questions change. Nader's concept of studying up was developed further by Reinhold's idea of studying through, according to which anthropologists should attempt to trace the ways in which power creates webs and relations between actors, institutions, and discourses across space and time. More recently, anthropologists have attempted to understand the ways in which specific ideas within policy move across time and space as they are afforded by concrete individuals involved in the policymaking process. The dissemination of policy, particularly the changes in text between drafts and different levels of government, is a growing area of disciplinary interest. Identifying how policies are interpreted and reinterpreted across settings allows researchers to discern if the legislative intent that motivated the creation of a policy has been changed, lost, or altered in the final text with which bureaucrats work. Next, that takes me to actor network theory. So, some of you may know, since the creation of sociology and anthropology as academic disciplines, scholars have been debating the question of agency, or the ability of a person or a thing to act or react within human populations. It leads us to great quotes like Bourdieu's structure, 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 structure. Broader conversations in the discipline tend to examine the role of society or these social structures to shape the role of individuals and their ability to make decisions. This conversation has continued, with a number of theorists taking a variety of diverse positions on the matter. With the emergence of science technology studies, or STS, and science and technology policy studies, STP, in the 1960s and 70s, social scientists began to examine the role of technology that has in our lives and how technology may or may not change us. Latour, and later Cologne, created a theoretical and methodological framework with which scientists can identify the networks linking people to the many objects in their lives and how those objects connect people in complex ways. This framework allows for objects to be understood as nodes within a network that, to some degree, have agency, a property that conventional social scientists reserved for humans alone. By understanding humans and non-human objects as possessing agency, researchers are better able to identify the operations of all those nodes in a network across time and space, enabling them to create three-dimensional charts that pay equal attention to the mutually impacting operations of people, places, industries, and things. Through this approach, social scientists are better able to engage these networks through which these interactions occur, being acted on, and acted upon humans and other non-human agents within the network. For example, in my project, we identified uranium as a thing with non-human agency that allows it to act on individuals because of its nature as a radioactive substance. In turn, uranium's agency is mediated by the people, policies, and industries that fundamentally change its power through the enrichment process. Sayers argues that while non-human objects may have agency, they have more or less of it because of the object and circumstance of how the people interact with it. For example, a seatbelt. Because it restrains a person during deceleration, it has more agency than a law that demands the passengers must wear seatbelts. So while all the nodes in the actor network may have agency, the form and amount of agency is not the same across all human and non-human actors. Now finally, this takes me to nuclear anthropology, which kind of awkwardly straddles the idea of a topic and a theory, because there's something being built upon, but it's still not quite clear what it is yet. So over the past 30 years, anthropologists have engaged in research focused on nuclear development. Their primary concern, though, has been weaponry, including the detrimental effects of its testing on so-called nuclear populations. The work of these researchers have demonstrated a particular interest in the institutions surrounding nuclear weapon testing in the Pacific Ocean, and how those institutions have responded to the fallout on the environment, the native populations, as well as nearby US Navy personnel. Similarly, anthropologists have focused on the historical development of the weapons, with a particular focus on how the creation of the Manhattan Project and the national labs changed the lives of the involved researchers, the regions, the national imaginaries. Nuclear social scientists have also taken a keen interest in understanding how local communities perceive, understand, and react to nuclear development, such as uranium mining in Navajo communities in the western United States. So there's a focus towards weapons, fetishization, and landscape, but all broadly on this idea of nuclear development. Using these frameworks from the anthropology-related fields, this research attempts to identify the social life of uranium by tracing the connections between the policymakers, policy writers, bureaucratic implementation, decision makers, and local communities. By doing so, this research will identify a detailed network of the actors and interpret and reinterpret the role of uranium within Texas and the surrounding areas at each stage of the production cycle. This research seeks to understand the perspectives of these communities, utilizing both qualitative and quantitative analyses in an attempt to identify possible attributes of these communities that either support, oppose, or display ambivalence towards new or renewed nuclear development in any locales. I hypothesize in part that communities close to these locations of production, the mining, the nuclear generating stations, waste disposal sites, have more constant and possibly more effective communication with governmental and business actors than those further transposed from the processes, causing different concerns and iterations of, for example, risk between various locales. For that reason, this research will include 6 locations around Texas and surrounding area, investigating several major elements of the uranium fuel cycle. So as you can see, these are my 6 field sites, but you can notice one seems to be double, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So within Texas, going 1 mile into New Mexico upwardly, they essentially are able to capture a vertical production of nuclear energy, a vertical production of uranium. That being said, there's this sense of futures, and this is that while, for example, mining is occurring, I'll talk about that more in a second, it's in a state of waiting. The enrichment facility is fully built out. It's producing enriched uranium, but there's a question of how it's being sold, and the fact that it's not currently being sold to the power generation station in Bay City. It could eventually, but it's not yet. And so we're thinking through partly the fact that these are all happening right now to a degree, but also it's looking forward, and trying to figure out why. So the first site is Austin. So since the 1980s, Austin and San Antonio have diverged greatly in their approach to nuclear energy. The city of Austin owns 16% of the South Texas nuclear generating station, alongside San Antonio and NRG Energy. However, because of what they perceive to be massive cost overruns and after massive complaints from the community, they voted in the 90s to amend the city charter banning further investment in nuclear energy and determine that their stake in the nuclear generating should be sold. That being said, 30 years later, it still has not. So Austin is of particular interest because it's a site of energy use, but because it is the state capital, it's also the site of policy creation. It's where laws are being passed by the legislature, and it's where the headquarters for many agencies are also housed. The agencies, for example, TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, that governs environmental law in Texas, is also within Austin. In Austin, roughly about 10 miles north of the main UT campus, also has a university's nuclear engineering program with a Triga Mark II nuclear research reactor. These are, by scale, much smaller, and they use lowly enriched uraniums, which, if for something horrible were to happen, it probably wouldn't even affect the whole building. They use cool sites. But it means that Austin is a large part of this nuclear process in various ways, both through research, policy, and use. The next site I identify is Brooks County, Texas. Now, this is located roughly 75 miles north of the Texas and Mexico border, adjacent to the Rio Grande Valley. In this area lies the Alta Mesa in situ recovery mine and plant facility. And this mine, which was previously owned by a wealthy local family and is now controlled by an international conglomerate called Energy Fuels, has previously mined nearly 4 million pounds of sandstone roll-front uranium deposits since 2005. After the purchase of the mine was complete, Energy Fuels, the international company, discontinued operations of the fully permitted facility until, as they quote, determined that uranium prices increase, leaving the plant idling so far for years. So it's a fully built out, fully permitted facility that's in state of idling. This research seeks to understand the circumstances in which Energy Fuels and its previous owners decided to make this investment in uranium mining in the 21st century, and how those choices are perceived and understood by the local community. Now, that takes us to a site of uranium enrichment in Lee County. So the previous field sites, it looked like there's only 5 pins. That's because 2 field sites on the Texas-New Mexico border are that close to each other. Andrews County, the field site from Waste Texas Specialist, which we'll talk about in a moment, is within half a mile of the Texas-New Mexico border. And this enrichment facility by Urenco USA is about 1.5 miles or so from the border. This is the only field site, obviously, in the study outside of Texas. And it's vital to understand the uranium fuel cycle in the region due to Urenco's nuclear enrichment facility. It lies, like as I said, within miles of the border. This facility was conceived by the multinational company in the early 2000s and began complete operations in 2010. The company that owns it is fairly complex and used to be owned partly by the governments of France and Germany. It's been, over the last few years, so who controls it, who has the stakes, been changing pretty dramatically. This research seeks to identify the historical and contemporary intent of Urenco, and will analyze the political and policy-based circumstances in which the company chose to build this facility, despite in what the early 2000s seemed to have a downward trend of national and international demand for enriched uranium for civilian use that's been going back for almost half a century now. So one of the big questions I have in this study is, they built this multi-billion-dollar facility in the early 2000s. Uranium prices are going down, uranium demand is going down. Why did they build it? What was the intent, and how are the local communities responding to its creation? Next, along the vertical production line, is the site of energy generation, which is in Bay City, Texas. This is where the South Texas Nuclear Generating Station is held, where they contain nuclear reactors STP-1 and STP-2, which have been in operation for the most part since the late 1980s. As I mentioned, it's originally was financed through a consortium with the cities of Austin at 16%, San Antonio at 40%, and NRG Energy with 44%. Attempts to expand the facility have floundered for the most of the last decade, with the failure to secure partnerships and capital. Even one particular variation in which they were attempting to expand nuclear reactors 3 and 4 to create them, met with nuclear national security concerns because it meant Toshiba was going to have majority ownership, which is against US law because it's a foreign company. So as recently as 2016, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has fully permitted 2 more reactors to be built, as I quote, when market conditions support construction decisions. Next, that takes us to San Antonio, which is the primary site of energy use. So while San Antonio has a very history toward nuclear energy, the proposed expansions I just mentioned led to a great deal of debate within the community from 2009 to 2011, ending after public sentiment of nuclear energy for the most part turned downward after the Fukushima Daiichi accident. Despite this, CPS Energy, a municipality-owned utility, provided an investment for 7.265% of 2 more reactors that has since been written off as a loss. However, they still want to make sure and identify that if the reactors ever get built, they own that 7.625% of the energy. And finally, a proposed waste facility site disposal. So Andrews County, Texas is currently the location of a low-level radioactive waste disposal facility. As I said, very near the Texas-New Mexico border. It is owned by the Texas-based waste control specialists, although the company has since joined with Verano USA, another complex company owned by international corporations and has US subsidiaries, to create interim storage partners in an attempt to get approval for high-level radioactive waste disposal, allowing it to potentially store spent fuel if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission approves. Which means potentially, depending on what the proposals get through, what permits exist, and what permits are finally allowed, it could be an alternative site to Yucca Mountain, which the state of Nevada has successfully kept out from being a waste disposal site for most of the last 50 years. So my research schedule, this is a little bit awkward. It has to do with the fact about feasibility more than anything else. So as you've noticed, several of these field sites are very near large and extensive oil operations, which make feasibility of long-term ethnographic study in each of these locations kind of difficult. I found that, for example, a proposed $20,000 grant, I could afford 6 weeks in Lake County, New Mexico. So because it's 6 field sites, and I'm aiming for a 1 year of ethnographic study, I had to divide this time tactically. In Austin and Brooks County, I'm anticipating 8 weeks or 2 months of field work. Lee County, approximately 6 weeks. Bay City, 8 weeks. San Antonio, 12 weeks. And Andrews County, Texas, 6 weeks. And so what am I going to be doing at these sites if approved? And so I'm going to be focusing on 3 main areas of research: focus groups, semi-structured interviews, and participatory and community mapping. So several focus groups will be conducted at each research site. Primarily, several groups of 5 to 10 participants will be determined depending on age range. While the ranges themselves will need to be piloted to determine maximum efficiency, I expect these ranges to roughly fit a schematic of 18 to 25, 26 to 31, 32 to 45, and over 45. And what these age ranges actually support are various levels of nuclear development in Texas over the last few decades. For example, if they're 18 to 25, they're living in this time of revitalized nuclear development. This push towards something, not necessarily investments, what I'm trying to understand. If they're 26 to 31, they're at a range with the nuclear reactors in Texas and South Texas projects have always been active. And so they might have a lived nuclear experience, especially towards these sites that are closer towards the production. The third group of 32 to 45 is late nuclear development, which is, I think, for the most part, when between the construction of STP-1 nuclear reactor and the completion of STP-2, when that's great. And finally, over 45 is the early nuclear development, including the proposals and policy constructions based off of what eventually created the South Texas Nuclear Generating Station. So while I'm focusing those numbers on South Texas' use of nuclear energy, I believe it'll work towards all these locations because they roughly map onto all these different types of nuclear development in the United States at large. So all members of the committee will be eligible and encouraged to gain a wide range of levels of knowledge and experiences from the participants. And while it's my hope that some of these focus groups will yield perspectives from those with some background in the issue, those with experts or technical knowledge may be dissuaded or silenced other participants who have both knowledge or personal experience with the topics. So it's something I have to be highly aware of, that someone who's closely related to these fields might try to speak over, prevent folk knowledge and personally understood experiences of these individuals. Next, semi-structured interviews. At each field site, research will include at least 25 to 50 semi-structured interviews with different individuals at each field site. Participants will be selected in part to equally represent genders and age regions, as I previously mentioned, as well as their interactions with nuclear production, mining, working at the plant, case interaction, and potential of policy networks. Topics will include daily use and interaction with nuclear energy, if and how nuclear energy or its production directly impacts daily or personal lives, if and how life and or the community has changed since the emergence or re-emergence of nuclear production. And these perceptions are part of how health, communication, and these entanglements of networks are understood or impacted, and how any of these ideas are communicated at the local, state, national, or international politicians and programs. And finally, participatory and community mapping. For each of these exercises, participants will be given a pre-printed topographical satellite image of the area generated on Google Earth before fieldwork begins. Participants will then write or draw on these maps to identify the information being sought. So no expertise in Google Earth or related technologies will be necessary for informants to participate. So referring to participatory mapping, I'm referring to a means for gathering information about natural resources, special sites, and local perceptions within a shared geographical framework. So this process allows for me to work collaboratively with my informants to identify geographical locations and boundaries associated with these nuclear landscapes and where their entanglements start, stop, and what they are bounded by. This will allow for understanding on what local inhabitants at each site identify as being potentially dangerous in its source, as well as creating the opportunity to compare ideologies of communication efficacy from nuclear energy to other concerns. This method will be utilized in conjunction with these semi-structured interviews. So community map is a little bit different in that it's a map produced collaboratively by residents together of a particular locale, often featuring local knowledge and resources. So participatory maps, and the way I'm using it, is that it'll be one-on-one with the informants I'm working with the semi-structured interviews. The community mapping will be probably conducted with the focus groups. So similar to the process of participatory mapping, these maps should be produced solely by the individuals participating in these focus groups without the involvement of the researcher, myself. And unlike participatory mapping, which will have a stated focus on, for example, on the economy and networks, these maps will be designed by the participants to include any and all buildings, areas, etc., that they deem to be important, and how the landscape has changed over the last 50 years. In a group setting, these maps hopefully will elicit stories that provide more detail on their history and their significance as a place. Takes me to data analysis, which will primarily occur in the 12 months following the field work, contemporaneously with writing up the results of the dissertation. The data analysis will be primarily textual and linguistic in nature, including the use of grounded theory and context analysis, as well as critical discourse analysis. While these methods of analyses are primarily qualitative in nature, they do allow for the close examination of recurring themes, and in particular words or phrases found in close relation to each other. That's primarily where the numbers and the quantitative come from. It's textual. So coding is obviously a large part of this. So during this stage, all texts, which I use broadly to mean any written text, any policy, any laws, any interviews, any video, it is all text that emerged from the research will be encoded to identify categories that these texts speak to. This process, in which specific statements are analyzed and categorized into clusters of meaning that represent phenomena of interest, according to Starnes and Trinidad, allow for the researchers to see themes emerge from the text without being bound by preconceived notions of what to look for. All data will be entered into MaxPDA Plus, which will be maintained in an encrypted and password protected form, which I'm required to say for IRB reasons. Both outliers and represented text will be transcribed in their entirety to demonstrate the variation of data within the corpus. That takes me to content analysis. So using this encoded data, we're identifying themes from the corpus. So a theme, according to Calipexia, is defined by overarching categories preceded by the community to be associated with terms and ideas. So for the purpose of this study, themes associated with policy, bureaucracy, communication, etc., will all be used as proxies to understand how communities act and are acted upon and reacted upon government policy regarding the production of uranium, including its mining and use over the last 50 years. I hypothesized, as I mentioned previously, that communities closer to the actual sources of production, mining, nuclear generating station, and waste, will have higher incidences and themes of communication bureaucracy, while those divorced physically from the production, primarily use, like San Antonio and Austin, will focus on policy. And finally, critical discourse analysis, or CDA. It's a method that connects social theory and traditional discourse analysis to describe, interpret, and explain the ways in which discourse constructs and is constructed by macro and micro social worlds. This allows for the analysis of the intersection created by language and social practices to constitute or identify constitutions of power. CDA is especially used for formal analysis due to its evaluation of the historical development of discourse, and in turn, how discourse shapes cultural, social, and political practices. So these discourses, these texts, will be recorded in previously encoded field notes, interviews, and focus groups, and will be analyzed alongside the archived materials, newspapers, policy papers, etc., to identify how power is created and reified through the social lives of nuclear policy and uranium production. So finally, that takes me to intellectual merit and broader impacts. So the main goal of this project, or many of them, is to operationalize and expand these two growing bodies of work in anthropology, the Victorian anthropologic theory and the anthropology of policy, by analyzing how lives, laws, and policies interconnect and respond to the explosive growth and nuclear development within Texas. Comparatively little anthropological attention has been paid to the changing modes of development and politics of nuclear energy in the 21st century, including how lives and social structures may be affected by Texas's continued growth within the last decade, despite nuclear power's lower projections of the US in international stages. Unlike other sources of energy, nuclear energy development is closely monitored and regulated through the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and various nations due to fears of possible nuclear weapon creation due to the very similar processes. This project expands on a tradition of anthropological study on the impact of nuclear production, and an alternative analysis that has become more prominent over the last several years. But while that research in nuclear social science has primarily focused on health and environmental impacts, the federalization of the nuclear state, and the security of the nuclear state, limited research has been conducted on the nuclear energy cycle itself. This project seeks to document how uranium and its connected policies at the local, state, national, and international levels work to inform and transform each other in a changing economic and energy landscape. So, with that, I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Michael Seabed, the rest of my committee, Dr. Joe Flourier, Dr. Patrick Gallagher, and Dr. Ken Walker, absolutely everyone in the Department of Anthropology that has gone through with me in the last several years, as well as the Department of English, which has been a major support, as well as various university partners that I've taken advantage of, such as my academic coach at the TRC, Michelle Cal, the Teaching and Learning Services, that make sure I try to stay as seen as possible. And with that, if anyone has a question, I'm happy to answer them.
strong differences at the local level between perceptions of folks from New Mexico and folks from Texas on nuclear power and its advantages or value?
Honestly, at this point, no. But there's something interesting in particular about New Mexico that particularly constrains this research that I need to investigate more through the process. Is part of the question I had about why enrichment facilities in New Mexico was why did they make that choice, especially when Texas has very different laws. And part of what I've discovered in the past year or so is that New Mexico has very loose environmental laws in particular ways. And so I suspect that might change in part how the local community reacts to a facility based on what those expectations are. That being said, New Mexico as a whole has been a large part of Nuclear Alley for the last 50 years, especially now. So they might be already acclimatized to these expectations and ideals. So what environment through policy might be very different, their population might be very similar or different. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Can you go to the slide before your acknowledgements, please? Okay. I wanted to ask first on your interviews, you're planning for 25 to 50 per site. That's a lot of interviews. But I was going to ask you, since it's only one of your sites first part of more than one, what's the word I'm looking for? Like Austin is used for policy, for research, and for use. Is that going to be one of the sites where you're probably going to get closer to hitting those 50 interviews because it's a multi-use site compared to, for instance, San Antonio, that it's just consumption?
This is a conversation I've had with my entire committee in the past couple of weeks, and that when I use the number 50 in particular, I'm expecting a bunch of bits and pieces. And that, especially because of what the topic is and how people's different relations to the topic, you know, I might get a little bit of data from one person, it might be a 10-minute conversation worth, and others I might get several hours. So when I say 50 interviews, I use that semi-structure pretty loosely in that I might only be able to answer or get answered 2 or 3 questions that are relevant. And that might have been 20, 30 minutes of their life. And so I might potentially be able to do a lot of those. Or if I find some really great key informants, that number by necessity will need to be lower.
Okay. Thank you.
No other questions from the crowd? All right, I guess it's time for the faculty to dig in a little bit. So thank you everybody for coming and hang out outside or talk to Ray later, right? Yeah, other faculty can stay current in here, right?
No, that's their own.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good job.
So we just
Bye. See you later.